The elevator's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the polished brass buttons, each floor number etched deep enough to catch the gleam of 14-karat gold fixtures that cost more than most families made in 6 months. David Johnson pressed his thumb against the cool metal of button 18, feeling the weight of his worn Jansport backpack, a stark contrast to the Italian marble walls that surrounded him like a monument to wealth he'd never known. At 14, David had learned to read rooms the way other kids read comic books. The elevator's soft jazz couldn't mask the tension in his mother's breathing, that shallow rhythm she developed whenever she entered Hassan Al-Mansuri's domain. Grace Johnson, 42 years old and carrying a cleaning bucket that had seen 5 years of scrubbing other people's messes, stood perfectly still beside her son. Her uniform, burgundy polyester that never quite looked clean, no matter how much she washed it, bore the faint scent of industrial disinfectant and the weight of swallowed pride. "Mom," David whispered, his voice barely audible above the elevator's mechanical hum. "You sure about this?" Grace's reflection in the polished steel doors showed a woman who had aged beyond her years. Dark circles under eyes that once sparkled with dreams of nursing school hands, roughened by chemicals that promised hospital-grade cleanliness, but delivered nothing but dry, cracked skin. "Baby, sometimes you gotta show people who you really are, even when they don't want to see it." The 18th floor opened onto a world David had only glimpsed through partially open doors during his mother's late shifts. Carrara marble stretched across the floor like a frozen sea, each vein of gold threading through the stone, worth more than their Bronx apartment's yearly rent. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Manhattan that made the city look like a conquered kingdom, every building below bowing to the height of Al-Mansuri Industries. Hassan Al-Mansuri sat behind a desk carved from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood, its surface reflecting the morning light like dark water. At 48, he carried himself with the particular arrogance of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. His Tom Ford suit, navy with threads so fine they caught light like silk, had been tailored in Milan by hands that charged more per hour than Grace made in a week. "Grace," Hassan's voice carried the cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed instantly. "You're late, and you brought company." David stepped forward, his Nike sneakers, clean but clearly from Payless, not the boutique where Hassan's children shopped, silent on the marble. "Good morning, Mr. Al-Mansuri. I'm David Johnson." Hassan's laugh echoed through the office like champagne being poured into crystal, effervescent, expensive, and somehow mocking everything it touched. "Johnson, I thought your mother's name was Williams when she applied." "It is," Grace said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 explanations she'd given to teachers, landlords, and employers who needed family structures explained in terms they could approve. "David has his father's name." "Ah." Hassan leaned back in his chair, Italian leather creaking softly. "And where is Mr. Johnson today? Let me guess. Another deadbeat who couldn't handle responsibility." David felt heat rise in his chest, but his voice remained level. "My father died when I was 6. Afghanistan." The silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was calculating. Hassan's eyes swept over David's appearance like a scanner reading a barcode. Clearance items, discount store worthless. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said in a tone that suggested he wasn't sorry at all. "But that doesn't explain why you're in my office." "David's smart," Grace said, stepping slightly forward. "Really smart. He's been helping me with things. Numbers, languages. I thought maybe you could—" "Languages." Hassan's eyebrows rose with theatrical interest. "How fascinating. Let me guess. He speaks Spanish because you watch Telemundo." David's backpack suddenly felt heavier, inside protected by plastic folders and wrapped in cloth to prevent creasing lace certificates and documents that represented 3 years of work most adults couldn't complete. But Hassan's assumption, casual, cruel, automatic, reminded David that in rooms like this, evidence mattered less than expectation. "Actually," David said, his voice carrying a quiet strength that made Hassan pause, "I speak 9 languages." The laugh that erupted from Hassan was pure theater. He threw his head back, revealing teeth whitened to an unnatural brightness, and slapped his palm against the rosewood desk. "9 languages, Grace. Your boy has quite an imagination. Tell me, David, what are these 9 magical languages you've mastered?" Grace's knuckles went white around the cleaning bucket's handle. She had seen this before. The moment when Hassan's cruelty transformed from professional dismissal into personal entertainment. In 5 years of scrubbing his toilets and emptying his trash, she had watched him destroy grown men with this same amused contempt. English, Spanish, French, German, Arabic, Mandarin, Russian, Italian, and Portuguese. David recited each language rolling off his tongue with the precision of someone who had practiced this moment countless times. Hassan's smile widened. Remarkable. And where did you acquire this impressive education, Harvard, Princeton? Oh, wait, I forgot. The Bronx public school system. My mistake. The office fell silent except for the soft hum of climate control maintaining perfect temperature for perfect people. Outside the windows, Manhattan continued its relentless pursuit of more. More money, more power, more reasons to look down on those still climbing. David unzipped his backpack with deliberate slowness. The sound seemed amplified in the marble chamber, each metal tooth separating with a tiny click that counted down to something Hassan couldn't yet see coming. You're right to be skeptical, David said, pulling out a folder worn soft at the edges. That's why I brought proof. Hassan's confidence wavered for exactly 3 seconds as he looked at the document David placed on his desk. The letterhead from Columbia University's Department of Applied Linguistics gleamed under the office's designer lighting official seal, embossed deep enough to catch shadows. But it was the grades listed beneath David's name that made Hassan's throat tighten. Not just passing scores, but marks that indicated mastery-level proficiency in languages most diplomats struggled with after years of study. This is... Hassan's voice trailed off as he turned the page revealing certificate after certificate. The Municipal Library's Advanced Language Program, Queen's Community College's Translation Studies, online academies from universities in Beijing, Madrid, and Rome. Each stamp authentic, each signature verified each date, creating a timeline of learning that began when David was 11 years old. Fake, Hassan declared, but his voice carried none of its earlier conviction. Anyone can print certificates on a computer. David reached for his phone, a device Hassan suddenly noticed wasn't the latest iPhone his own children carried, but a carefully maintained model several generations old. The screen flickered to life, displaying a Zoom interface already loaded with a contact. Professor Chen, David said, his voice shifting into Mandarin so fluent and natural that Hassan felt something cold settle in his stomach. The conversation flowed like water, complex grammatical structures and cultural references weaving together in a way that couldn't be faked or memorized. A woman appeared on the screen, sitting in what was clearly an academic office books in Chinese, lining the shelves behind her. She responded in rapid Mandarin, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure at seeing David. The conversation continued for 2 minutes, covering topics from international trade regulations to classical Chinese poetry before David asked her to switch to English. Professor Chen, could you tell Mr. Al-Mansuri about my performance in your business translation course? The woman's smile broadened. David is extraordinary. In 15 years of teaching, I have never encountered a student so young with such mature understanding of linguistic nuance. His Mandarin is not just fluent, it's culturally sophisticated. He understands context, subtext, and business protocol in ways that graduate students struggle with. Hassan's hands trembled slightly as he ended the call. The casual arrogance that had sustained him through decades of looking down on people like David and Grace suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass. There are 8 other professors I could call, David said quietly, putting his phone away. But I think you understand the point. Grace watched her son with a mixture of pride and terror. She had known David was special, had seen him reading college textbooks while his classmates struggled with picture books, had watched him help elderly neighbors translate important documents, had found him late at night listening to foreign news broadcasts just to practice comprehension. But seeing him command respect from a man who had spent 5 years treating her like furniture was both thrilling and frightening. How? Hassan's voice came out as barely a whisper. How does a 14-year-old boy from the Bronx master 9 languages? David sat down in the chair across from Hassan's desk without being invited. The gesture was small but significant, a claim of space in a room designed to make people like him feel insignificant. My mom works 3 jobs. David began, his voice carrying no self-pity, just facts. She leaves for the first one at 5 in the morning, comes home at 3 to get me from school, then leaves for her evening shift at 7. I'm alone from 7 p.m. to midnight most nights. Hassan glanced at Grace, seeing her properly for the first time in years. The woman who had silently emptied his trash and cleaned his bathroom suddenly had dimension. A mother working herself to exhaustion, a person with responsibilities and sacrifices he had never bothered to consider. I could watch TV or get in trouble like other kids, David continued. Or I could go to the library. They have language programs every day, conversation groups, online resources, all free. All I needed was time and motivation. But why languages? Hassan asked, genuinely curious now. David's eyes met Hassan's directly. Because I wanted to understand the world. And because I realized that when you speak to people in their language, they stop seeing you as a stranger and start seeing you as a human being. The observation hit Hassan like a physical blow. For years, he had used his Arab background as justification for keeping distance from American employees, citing cultural differences when the truth was simple prejudice. He spoke English with barely an accent, had been in the country for 30 years, but still referred to these Americans as if he were perpetually foreign. David, Hassan said, his voice changing tone entirely. Why did you come here today? Your mother could lose her job. David and Grace exchanged a glance that carried years of whispered conversations and careful planning. Because I heard you on the phone yesterday, David said calmly. You were discussing a contract with investors from the Middle East, but you made mistakes that could cost millions. Hassan's face went pale. What kind of mistakes? You used Mubashir when you should have used Ajil for urgency. You confused Mirak with Miraib when discussing deadlines. Small mistakes that completely changed the meaning of your proposals. Hassan sat down heavily. The investors had seemed confused during the call, asking for clarification on points he thought were clear. He had attributed it to poor connection quality, never considering that his own Arabic, the language of his childhood, his mother tongue, might have deteriorated after years of conducting business primarily in English. How did you know I was making mistakes? Hassan asked. Because I've been studying business Arabic for 2 years, David replied. It's my specialty. I've analyzed transcripts of international trade negotiations, studied regional dialect differences, learned the formal protocols for different types of commercial discussions. Hassan stared at David with new eyes. This boy had surpassed his own linguistic abilities in a language Hassan considered his birthright. More than that, David had identified flaws that could destroy deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. David reached into his backpack again, this time pulling out a document that made Hassan's breath catch. It was a detailed analysis of Al-Mansuri Industries' international communications over the past 2 years, identifying linguistic errors, cultural missteps, and missed opportunities. The work was professional grade, the kind of analysis Hassan paid consultants thousands of dollars to produce. You analyzed my company, Hassan whispered. Just the public communications, David explained. Press releases, transcripts from investor calls, translated documents posted on your website. I found patterns of mistakes that explain some lost business opportunities. Hassan read through the analysis twice. It was brilliant, thorough, and devastating. David had identified specific deals that had fallen through due to communication errors, quantifying the cost of Hassan's linguistic arrogance at over $50 million in lost revenue. Why? Hassan asked, his voice breaking slightly. Why did you do this work? David leaned forward, his young face serious beyond his years. Because I wanted to show you that value isn't determined by your parents' bank account. It's determined by what you can contribute. The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Hassan felt something crack inside his chest. Not his heart breaking, but his assumptions shattering. For 30 years, he had climbed social ladders by stepping on people he considered beneath him. He had mistaken wealth for worth, position for intelligence, privilege for merit. Hassan, David said, using his first name for the first time. Can I ask you a question? Hassan nodded, not trusting his voice. If a kid like me can do this using public libraries and free internet access, what could other young people like me accomplish with the same opportunities your children have? The question detonated in Hassan's mind like a carefully placed explosive. His own children attended elite private schools, had personal tutors, traveled internationally, spoke to native speakers of various languages during family vacations. Yet none of them had achieved what David had accomplished using scraps of opportunity and iron determination. Hassan was still processing the implications when David reached into his backpack one final time. What he pulled out was small, unremarkable. Just a digital recorder, the kind students use to tape lectures. But when David placed it on the desk, Hassan's blood turned to ice water. Before you answer that question, David said, his voice still calm, still respectful, but now carrying an edge that made Hassan's hands shake. I need to show you something else. David pressed play. Hassan's voice filled the office, clear and unmistakable, carrying words that could destroy everything he had built. These black Americans are all the same. Lazy, uneducated, always blaming others for their failures. That's why I only hire Arabs and whites for important positions. Grace is useful because she knows her place, but I'd never trust any of them with real responsibility. The recording continued for another 30 seconds, Hassan's voice mixing with that of his vice president, Robert Chen, their conversation growing more explicitly racist with each exchange. They discussed specific employees, mocking names and backgrounds, laughing about keeping those people in janitorial and security roles where they belonged. Grace's hand flew to her mouth, not in shock at the content. She had suspected Hassan's true feelings for years, but in horror that David had captured such damning evidence. The legal implications crashed over her like a wave. Wrongful termination lawsuits, discrimination claims, federal investigations, the end of everything. Hassan's face cycled through colors, red with rage, white with fear, gray with nausea. Where did you record this? He stammered. In the elevator last Wednesday, David replied, his voice steady as a surgeon's hand. You and Mr. Chen were discussing why you never promote black employees to management positions. You didn't notice I was there. Hassan remembered the conversation perfectly. He had been frustrated with the HR department's diversity initiatives, complaining to Chen about federal pressure to hire and promote minorities. They had been alone in the elevator, or so he thought. That's illegal. Hassan exploded, standing up so quickly his chair rolled backward. You can't record private conversations without consent. New York is a one-party consent state, David responded calmly. As long as one person in the conversation agrees to the recording, it's completely legal. And considering this documents systematic racial discrimination in hiring and promotion practices, I'm sure the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission would find it very interesting. Hassan felt the world spinning around him. A recording like this wouldn't just cost him money, it would destroy his reputation, trigger federal investigations, result in boycotts and protests. His children's private school admissions would be reconsidered, country club memberships revoked, business partnerships dissolved. Everything he had built through 3 decades of calculated cruelty would crumble in the time it took to upload a file to YouTube. What do you want? Hassan whispered. David smiled, but it wasn't the smile of a 14-year-old boy. It was the smile of someone who had spent months planning every move of an intricate chess game, someone who had learned that the only way to beat a rigged system was to become better at the game than those who rigged it. I want you to choose, David said, walking around the desk to stand directly in front of Hassan. The boy was tall for his age, but still had to look up to meet the man's eyes. Yet somehow in that moment, Hassan felt like the smaller person. You can continue believing that people like me and my mother are inferior, David continued. And this recording goes to every journalist, labor lawyer, and civil rights organization in New York. Or you can prove that you actually learned something today. Hassan's throat worked soundlessly. What do you want? David pulled a contract from his backpack, professionally printed and organized, complete with legal language and specific terms. Hassan realized with growing horror that this confrontation wasn't spontaneous. It was the culmination of months of planning. I want you to promote my mother to facilities supervisor with a salary of $80,000 a year, David said, reading from the contract. I want a scholarship fund established for students from underserved communities with a minimum annual budget of $200,000, and I want you to hire me as a junior language consultant. You're 14 years old, Hassan protested weakly, and I speak 9 languages better than most adults you employ, David shot back. I've already proven I can save your company millions of dollars. Age is just a number. Competence is what matters. Hassan looked at Grace, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, but whose eyes now shone with a pride and dignity he had never bothered to notice. In 5 years of employment, he had never asked about her family, her dreams, her struggles. She had been invisible to him, useful but unimportant, present but not significant. Grace, Hassan said, his voice cracking. You raised a genius. I raised a man, Grace replied firmly. A man who knows his worth and won't accept being treated as less than he is. David placed the contract on Hassan's desk next to a gold pen that cost more than most people's monthly rent. You have 5 minutes to decide. After that, this recording becomes public property. Hassan picked up the contract with trembling hands. It was thorough, professional, and surprisingly reasonable. The salary increase for Grace was significant, but fair for a supervisory position. The scholarship fund, while substantial, represented less than Hassan spent annually on his personal wine collection. David's consulting fee was modest, almost insulting for someone with his demonstrated abilities. "How do I know you won't release the recording even if I sign?" Hassan asked. David met his eyes with a level gaze that carried wisdom far beyond his years. "Because unlike you, Mr. Al-Mansuri, I believe in giving people second chances when they genuinely want to change." Hassan stared at the contract, his life balanced on the edge of a decision that would define his legacy. He could refuse, call his lawyers, try to destroy a 14-year-old boy and his cleaning lady mother. But David had outplayed him at every turn, demonstrated superior intelligence and planning, and held evidence that could end Hassan's career with a single upload. More than that, Hassan realized David had shown him something he had forgotten in 30 years of climbing social ladders, that real worth wasn't measured by bank accounts or zip codes, but by what people contributed to the world. "What if I sign this and you're not as good as you think you are?" Hassan asked. David's smile was confident but not arrogant. "Then you fire me and find someone better. But you won't need to." Hassan looked out his office windows at the Manhattan skyline, the city he had conquered, through a combination of intelligence, determination, and calculated cruelty. But this teenager had just outmaneuvered him, using only preparation, evidence, and moral clarity. "Grace," Hassan said softly, turning to face her. "Do you accept the promotion?" Grace looked at her son, who nodded encouragingly. "I accept, sir." Hassan picked up the gold pen and signed the contract with a flourish that had sealed hundreds of million-dollar deals. But this signature felt different, heavier, more permanent, like signing his name to a new understanding of himself. "David Johnson." Hassan said, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and bewilderment. "You just taught me the most expensive and valuable lesson of my life." "What lesson is that?" David asked. Hassan stood up, walked around his desk, and extended his hand to the boy, who had just revolutionized his worldview. "That real intelligence isn't about where you were born or how much money your parents have. It's about what you do with the opportunities you create for yourself." David shook Hassan's hand, his grip firm and confident. "Welcome to the 21st century, Mr. Al-Mansuri." As Hassan released David's hand, he felt like he was letting go of more than just a handshake. He was releasing 30 years of assumptions about merit, worth, and the value of human beings based on their circumstances rather than their character. But David wasn't finished. He reached into his backpack one more time, pulling out 2 additional recording devices. "For your information," David said casually, "everything that happened here today was also recorded, including you signing this contract voluntarily after hearing all the terms." Hassan laughed for the first time in years. Not the cruel laugh that had opened their encounter, but a sound of genuine admiration and disbelief. "You're a frighteningly intelligent kid." "No," David replied with a smile that finally looked his age. "I just prepared better." 6 months later, the executive elevator still hummed with the same mechanical precision. But everything else about Al-Mansuri Industries had changed. Hassan Al-Mansuri stood in the lobby at 7:30 a.m., something he had never done in 20 years of owning the building. He was waiting for the first group of scholarship recipients to arrive for their monthly mentorship breakfast, a program that had become the pride of his company and unexpectedly the source of his greatest professional satisfaction. Grace Johnson stepped out of the elevator wearing a tailored navy blazer that made her look like she had been born to wear suits instead of cleaning uniforms. As facilities supervisor, she had transformed not just her own life, but the entire culture of building maintenance. Employee satisfaction scores had jumped, 40% turnover had dropped to nearly zero, and cleaning efficiency had improved so dramatically that other companies were requesting consultations on her methods. "Good morning, Hassan," Grace said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned her own worth. The casual use of his first name, something that had taken months to establish, represented a revolution in workplace dynamics that extended far beyond a simple name change. "Morning, Grace. The kids here yet?" Through the glass doors, Hassan could see them approaching. 12 teenagers from the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn, each carrying acceptance letters to programs they couldn't have afforded 6 months ago. Maria Santos, 17, had been accepted to MIT's engineering program. Marcus Williams, 16, was headed to Georgetown's School of Foreign Service. Aisha Patel, 15, had won a full scholarship to study international business at NYU. But it was David Johnson who drew Hassan's attention as always. Now 15, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had changed the world and was just getting started. His responsibilities had grown from junior language consultant to director of international communications, making him the youngest department head in American corporate history. The Wall Street Journal had featured him on their cover with the headline, "The Polyglot Prodigy: How a Teenager Revolutionized Global Business Communication." "Mr. Al-Mansuri," Maria said as the group entered the lobby, "we brought someone new today. This is Carlos Rivera from my school. He speaks 6 languages." Hassan's eyes lit up. 6 months ago, he would have scoffed at a claim like that from a kid whose sneakers had holes in them. Now he knew better. "Carlos, which 6 languages?" "Spanish, English, Portuguese, French, Italian, and I'm learning Arabic." Carlos replied, his voice carrying the same mixture of pride and nervousness Hassan remembered from David's first visit. "Arabic?" Hassan's eyebrows rose. "Why Arabic?" "Because Mr. Johnson says it's the key to understanding international energy markets, and I want to work in renewable energy development." Hassan glanced at David, who smiled modestly. In 6 months, David had become not just an employee, but a mentor identifying talented young people and helping them channel their abilities towards specific career goals. The scholarship program had evolved from simple financial aid into a comprehensive development system that was producing results no one had anticipated. Carlos Hassan said, "Would you like to see something interesting?" He led the group to the elevator, taking them up to the 22nd floor, where the company's new International Development Center occupied an entire level. Through glass walls, they could see employees from 12 different countries working on projects spanning 6 continents. Translation services, cultural consulting, international market analysis, all services the company had previously outsourced, now handled in-house by the most diverse workforce in the industry. "This is what happens when you hire for talent instead of pedigree," Hassan explained, watching the teenagers' faces light up as they saw people who looked like them occupying positions of real authority. 18 months ago, this floor was empty. Now it generates $40 million in annual revenue. "How?" Marcus asked. David stepped forward. "By recognizing that linguistic and cultural competence are competitive advantages in global markets. Companies that understand their customers' cultures win contracts from companies that only speak corporate English." Hassan nodded. David's corrections to our international communications generated $200 million in new business last year. His cultural insights helped us avoid mistakes that would have cost us relationships with key partners. And his mentorship program has created a pipeline of talent that gives us advantages our competitors can't match. They moved to the conference room where David conducted his weekly analysis sessions. The walls displayed charts tracking the company's international performance, revenue growth, client satisfaction scores, market penetration in previously inaccessible regions. Every metric pointed upward, and every improvement could be traced to the cultural competence David had brought to the organization. "The most important thing we learned," Grace said, addressing the scholarship recipients, "is that diversity isn't just about fairness. It's about excellence. When you bring different perspectives, languages, and experiences together, you solve problems that homogeneous groups can't even see." Hassan pulled up a PowerPoint presentation on the conference room screen. "Let me show you what David's methodology looks like in practice." The first slide showed a deal that had stalled with a Brazilian energy consortium. Hassan's team had been using formal Portuguese in their communications, which came across as distant and disrespectful in Brazilian business culture. David had identified the problem and suggested switching to more conversational language, while incorporating specific cultural references that demonstrated genuine understanding of Brazilian values. The result, Hassan clicked to the next slide, was a $300 million contract that our competitors couldn't secure because they treated Brazil like just another market instead of a unique culture with its own business protocols. The teenagers took notes furiously, understanding that they weren't just seeing a presentation, but getting a masterclass in how cultural intelligence translated into real-world success. "Carlos," David said, "you mentioned renewable energy. Are you familiar with the linguistic challenges of international climate negotiations?" Carlos shook his head. The 2021 Climate Summit in Glasgow nearly failed because negotiators were using technical terms that had different implications in different languages. The Arabic word for commitment has legal connotations that the English word doesn't carry. The Mandarin phrase for binding agreement suggests permanence that scared some negotiators. Small language differences were creating massive political problems. Hassan watched Carlos's eyes widen as he realized the scope of opportunity in front of him. If you develop expertise in both renewable energy technology and the languages of key climate negotiations, you become irreplaceable. That's the secret, Grace added. Don't just learn languages. Learn to solve problems that only multilingual, multicultural people can solve. The morning session continued with each scholarship recipient presenting their progress and goals. Hassan listened with pride as teenagers who had been written off by the educational system demonstrated competence that surpassed many graduate students. They weren't just learning languages. They were developing the kind of comprehensive cultural intelligence that would make them valuable in any field they chose. But the most satisfying moment came when Carlos asked, "Mr. Al-Mansuri, what made you change your mind about people like us?" Hassan looked at David, then at Grace, then back at Carlos. David taught me that I had become exactly the kind of person who had discriminated against me when I was young. I came to this country at 16, barely speaking English, working in restaurants where customers treated me like I was stupid because of my accent. I swore I'd never let anyone make me feel small again. He paused, remembering the hunger and humiliation of those early years. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that feeling small doesn't justify making others feel small. I started treating people the way I had been treated instead of treating them the way I wished I had been treated. "What changed?" Maria asked. David showed me that real strength isn't about having power over others. It's about using whatever power you have to lift others up. And Grace taught me that dignity isn't something you're born with. It's something you choose every day, regardless of how others choose to see you. The scholarship recipients nodded, understanding that they weren't just hearing business advice, but life philosophy from people who had learned these lessons through experience rather than theory. As the session ended, Hassan walked with David to his office, a space that had been redesigned to accommodate both individual work and collaborative meetings. The walls displayed certificates in multiple languages, awards from international trade organizations, and photos of David with diplomats, business leaders, and other polyglots from around the world. "You know," Hassan said, settling into a chair across from David's desk, "I used to think success was about accumulation. More money, more recognition, more power over others. What do you think now?" David asked. "I think success is about multiplication. How many people can you help become more than they thought possible? How many problems can you solve that others can't? How much value can you create that didn't exist before?" David nodded. "That's why the scholarship program works. We're not just helping individuals. We're creating a network of culturally intelligent leaders who will solve problems we haven't even identified yet." Hassan looked out the window at Manhattan, the city that had once seemed like a kingdom to conquer, but now looked like a community to serve. "David, I need to ask you something. Do you ever regret the way you approached me that first day? The recording, the pressure, the ultimatum." David considered the question carefully. "I regret that it was necessary. I wish you had been able to see our worth without needing proof and leverage. But I don't regret doing what it took to create opportunities for people who deserve them, even though it could have destroyed your mother's career. Especially because it could have destroyed her career," David replied firmly. "She taught me that sometimes you have to risk everything to change everything. Standing up for yourself and others isn't safe, but it's necessary." Hassan smiled. "You know what the business schools are calling what you did, Wampini." "What?" Stunan. "The Johnson method. Strategic cultural intervention using competence-based leverage to transform organizational dynamics." David laughed. "That's a fancy way of saying, do your homework, gather evidence, and don't back down when you know you're right." "The Harvard Business Review wants to do a case study," Hassan continued. "They're calling it Disruptive Inclusion, How Linguistic Intelligence Revolutionized Corporate Culture." "Will you do it?" Hassan nodded. "But only if you and Grace co-author it. This story isn't about a billionaire learning to be better. It's about a family that refused to accept being undervalued and a community that transformed when given genuine opportunities." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city move around them. In 18 months, Al-Mansuri Industries had become a model for how businesses could succeed by embracing rather than merely tolerating diversity. Other companies were sending executives to study their methods. Universities were developing curricula based on their approach. Government agencies were consulting with them on international relations. But for Hassan, the greatest success was personal. He had recovered something he had lost during his climb to the top: the ability to see other people as full human beings worthy of respect and opportunity. And he had gained something he had never expected: the satisfaction that came from using wealth and power to multiply rather than concentrate opportunity. David Ronnie Hassan said finally, "Thank you for saving me from becoming someone I couldn't live with being. Thank you for proving that people can change when they choose to see clearly," David replied. As the afternoon sun streamed through the office windows, both of them understood that they weren't just running a business anymore. They were demonstrating that intelligence, preparation, and moral courage could transform not just individual lives, but entire systems. And that transformation multiplied across every person they mentored and every organization they influenced, was creating ripple effects that would extend far beyond anything they could measure or control. 2 years after that transformative morning in Hassan's office, the auditorium at the United Nations headquarters in New York buzzed with the particular energy that comes when people feel they're witnessing history being made. Representatives from 190 countries filled every seat, their attention focused on a panel discussion titled "Cultural Intelligence in Global Diplomacy: Lessons from the Private Sector." At the center of the stage sat David Johnson, now 17 years old, and speaking to an audience that included presidents, prime ministers, and Nobel laureates. To his right, Hassan al-Mansuri looked like a different man from the arrogant billionaire who had mocked a teenage boy's linguistic abilities. To David's left, Grace Johnson wore the confidence of someone who had traveled from cleaning bathrooms to advising Fortune 500 companies on inclusive leadership practices. The traditional model of international relations, David was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the assembly hall's sophisticated sound system, assumes that power flows from economic and military strength. But we've learned that sustainable influence comes from the ability to understand and communicate with people in ways that honor their dignity and respect their perspectives. The Secretary General of the United Nations, a woman who spoke 7 languages herself, leaned forward in her front row seat. "Mr. Johnson, you've achieved something that diplomats with decades of experience struggle with. You've created bridges between cultures that were previously considered incompatible. How do you explain this success?" David smiled, his boyish face now carrying the gravitas of someone who had spent 3 years solving problems that had stumped international experts. "I think the secret is that we approach cultural differences as competitive advantages rather than obstacles to overcome. When you genuinely understand how people think, what they value, and how they communicate, you can find solutions that create value for everyone involved." Hassan nodded. "The business results speak for themselves. In 30 months, our cultural intelligence approach has generated over $800 million in new revenue and prevented an estimated $200 million in losses that would have resulted from cultural misunderstandings. But the real success is that we've created a model that other organizations can replicate and improve upon." Grace stood up to address the assembly. When she had first started speaking publicly about their experience, she had been nervous about addressing audiences filled with people whose annual salaries exceeded her lifetime earnings. But she had learned that truth spoken with conviction commanded respect regardless of the speaker's background. "The most important thing we discovered," Grace said, her voice resonating through the hall, "is that diversity of thought and experience isn't just morally right, it's strategically essential. When organizations include people from different backgrounds, they make better decisions, create better products, and build better relationships with their stakeholders." The applause that followed was sustained and genuine. But the real impact of their presentation became clear during the question and answer session that followed. The ambassador from Brazil stood up. "Mr. Al-Mansuri, before your company adopted this approach, we had difficulty working with American businesses because they seemed to view Brazil as simply another market to penetrate rather than a partner to understand. Your team's cultural sensitivity changed everything. Can you explain how other companies could develop similar capabilities?" Hassan looked at David, who nodded for him to proceed. "The key is hiring and promoting people who bring authentic cultural knowledge, not just academic credentials." David didn't learn about international business from textbooks. He learned by immersing himself in different linguistic and cultural communities. That experiential knowledge can't be replicated in classrooms or seminars. The ambassador from Nigeria raised her hand. Ms. Johnson, you've spoken about the importance of recognizing talent regardless of where it's found. Many of our most brilliant citizens work in roles that don't utilize their full potential because of economic circumstances or educational barriers. How do we identify and develop these hidden assets? Grace's answer drew on 3 years of building talent development programs. You have to look beyond resumes and titles. Some of our most successful hires have been people who were working in entry-level positions, but demonstrated curiosity, determination, and cultural intelligence in their daily interactions. We created pathways for advancement that rewarded competence and character rather than just credentials. The questions continued for 90 minutes with representatives from every continent seeking advice on how to replicate their success. But the most meaningful moment came when a young woman from Somalia approached the microphone during the final question period. Mr. Johnson, she said, her English accented but perfectly clear, I am a refugee studying at Columbia University. I speak 5 languages and understand the culture of East Africa better than any textbook could teach. But employers see my refugee status and assume I am a charity case rather than an asset. How do I make them see my value? David stood up, his expression serious and compassionate. The same way I made Mr. Al-Mansuri see mine. Document your capabilities, gather evidence of your competence, and present solutions to problems they didn't even know they had. Don't ask for opportunities. Create opportunities by demonstrating the unique value you can provide. He paused, looking directly at the young woman. And remember that rejection from people who can't see your worth isn't a reflection of your value. It's a reflection of their limitations. Keep building your skills. Keep looking for leaders who understand that talent has no nationality, and never accept that someone else's prejudice defines your potential. The applause was thunderous, but David wasn't finished. More importantly, he continued, connect with others who share your experience. Some of our most successful initiatives have come from networks of multilingual, multicultural people who support each other and create opportunities together. You're not alone, and you're not asking for charity. You're offering capabilities that the world desperately needs. After the session ended, Hassan, David, and Grace were surrounded by diplomats, business leaders, and academics eager to learn more about their methodology. But Hassan was most proud of a conversation he overheard between David and a group of young people from various countries who had approached him seeking mentorship. The most important thing to remember, David was telling them, is that your background isn't a limitation, it's your competitive advantage. The world needs people who can bridge cultures, translate not just languages, but worldviews, and solve problems that require multiple perspectives. A young man from Bangladesh asked, but how do we convince employers to take chances on us? David's response drew on years of experience mentoring scholarship recipients who had faced similar challenges. Don't ask them to take chances. Reduce their risk by demonstrating competence so clearly that hiring you becomes the obvious choice. Solve problems for them before they hire you. Show them what they're missing by not utilizing your capabilities. And that's what I did, added a voice from behind them. They turned to see Carlos Rivera, now 18, and finishing his first year at Georgetown School of Foreign Service while working part-time as a renewable energy consultant. I didn't ask for an internship at the Department of Energy. I wrote an analysis of how linguistic barriers were complicating international climate negotiations and sent it to the Secretary's office. They hired me within a week. Hassan watched this exchange with deep satisfaction. The scholarship program he had reluctantly agreed to fund had become a self-sustaining network of cultural intelligence specialists who were creating opportunities not just for themselves, but for others who shared their backgrounds and challenges. Later that evening, at a private dinner hosted by the Secretary General, Hassan found himself in conversation with the president of the World Bank, who was eager to understand how cultural intelligence could improve international development programs. The problem with most development initiatives, the president was saying, is that we design solutions based on Western business models and then wonder why they don't work in different cultural contexts. Your approach suggests there might be a better way? Hassan nodded. The key insight is that sustainable solutions have to emerge from genuine understanding of local cultures, languages, and values. You can't impose external models and expect them to work. You need people who can think across cultures and communicate in ways that honor different perspectives. Are you suggesting we should hire more local talent in leadership positions? I'm suggesting you should hire the most culturally intelligent people you can find regardless of their backgrounds and give them authority to design solutions that make sense in specific contexts. Some of the best development economists in the world are probably working in entry-level positions because their cultural backgrounds aren't valued by traditional hiring processes. The conversation continued late into the evening with Hassan finding himself in the unexpected role of advocating for inclusive hiring practices with some of the world's most powerful institutional leaders. 3 years earlier, he had been the problem. Now he was using his platform and influence to scale solutions that could impact millions of lives. As the evening wound down, Hassan, David, and Grace rode back to their hotel in comfortable silence. The city lights of New York streamed past their window, each illuminated building representing thousands of lives and dreams, many of them constrained by the same kinds of assumptions that had once limited their own possibilities. "You know what I learned tonight?" Grace said, breaking the silence. "What's that?" Hassan asked. "That our story isn't really about us anymore. It's about proving that change is possible, that people can grow, and that talent exists everywhere if you know how to look for it." David nodded. "Every scholarship recipient who succeeds, every company that adopts inclusive hiring practices, every international negotiation that succeeds because someone understood cultural nuances, they're all part of the same story we started in your office 3 years ago." Hassan looked out at the city, remembering the man he had been when he first met David and Grace. Arrogant, closed-minded, cruel in ways that seemed justified by his own success. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, but it had been complete. He was a different person leading a different kind of company, contributing to a different kind of world. "I've been thinking about legacy lately," Hassan said. "What we leave behind when we're gone. 3 years ago, I would have left behind a company that made money by exploiting cultural barriers and maintaining inequality. Now I hope we're leaving behind proof that intelligence and goodness exist everywhere, and that success comes from lifting others up rather than keeping them down." David smiled. "The best part is that we're not leaving it behind. We're living it forward. Every person we mentor, every organization we influence, every barrier we help remove creates opportunities for people we'll never meet to achieve things we can't even imagine." Grace reached over and squeezed both their hands. "My grandmother used to say that you're only as successful as the people you help become successful. By that measure, we're just getting started." As their car pulled up to the hotel, Hassan realized that the most important transformation hadn't been in his business practices or public reputation. It had been in his understanding of what it meant to be fully human. For the first time in decades, he looked forward to tomorrow, not because of what he could acquire, but because of what he could contribute. The next morning, David received a call that would define the next phase of their journey. The caller was the Secretary of Education, inviting him to lead a new national initiative to identify and develop linguistic talent in underserved communities across America. "We want to replicate what you've accomplished at Al-Mansuri Industries on a national scale," the Secretary explained. "Create pathways for young people who have cultural and linguistic intelligence to contribute to international diplomacy, business, and development." David looked at Hassan and Grace, both of whom were listening to the speakerphone, with expressions of pride and excitement. "I'll accept on one condition," David said. "This has to be a partnership between the Department of Education, Al-Mansuri Industries, and the community organizations that actually serve these young people. Real change happens when institutions work with communities, not when they work for them." "Agreed," the Secretary replied immediately. "When can you start?" David smiled. "We already have." 6 months later, the first cohort of the National Cultural Intelligence Leadership Program graduated with job offers from Google, the State Department, the United Nations, and dozens of other organizations that had learned to value what Hassan, David, and Grace had spent years proving, that talent is distributed equally, but opportunity is not, and that closing that gap creates value for everyone involved. The program's motto, suggested by Grace and approved by unanimous vote, captured everything they had learned. Intelligence has no accent, competence has no color, and excellence emerges when opportunity meets preparation. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of their success came in a letter Hassan received from a young woman named Fatima al-Rashid, a Syrian refugee who had been working as a hotel housekeeper when she was selected for the program. "Mr. Al-Mansuri," she wrote, "3 years ago, I was cleaning rooms and being treated like I was invisible. Today, I signed a contract to lead cultural competency training for international aid organizations working in the Middle East. I make more in a month than I used to make in a year, but more importantly, I wake up every day knowing that my experiences, my languages, and my perspectives are valued and needed. Thank you for proving that people like me belong in rooms where decisions are made. And thank you for showing the world that when you invest in human potential, everyone wins. Hassan kept that letter framed on his desk not as a trophy of his generosity, but as a reminder of how much talent was still waiting to be discovered, developed, and celebrated. Every time he looked at it, he remembered the 14-year-old boy who had walked into his office with a worn backpack and 9 languages, and who had taught him that the measure of a person's worth had nothing to do with where they started and everything to do with what they were capable of contributing. The story that began with cruel laughter and linguistic skepticism had become a movement that was changing how organizations around the world identified, developed, and valued human talent. And at its center, the simple truth that David had demonstrated from the very beginning, that preparation, competence, and courage could overcome any barrier, transform any relationship, and create possibilities that hadn't existed before. In conference rooms and classrooms, in boardrooms and diplomatic chambers, in community centers and university halls, people were learning what Hassan, David, and Grace had discovered together, that excellence has no prerequisites except opportunity, and that the most powerful force for change is the decision to see clearly, act justly, and lift others as you climb. The boy who spoke 9 languages had taught the world a new one, the language of human potential unleashed, multiplied, and shared without limit or reservation. And that language, once learned, could never be unspoken or forgotten.